Hi, and welcome to Club English. You know, there's been a lot of stuff going on in the news lately, so I thought what I would do is I'd take the opportunity to hit a couple of major items that have been in the news, and there's a lot to cover, so pardon me if I, have some notes to look at, because it's just so much to remember. But the first thing that I wanted to talk about was the trucker convoy. Now, this was in Canada, but the fact is that a lot of people around the globe, a lot of truckers around the globe were inspired by the Canadian truckers. So we saw convoys also pop up in Netherlands and Europe, in Australia, and different places. So what was the Canadian Truckers Convoy? Well, their goal was a convoy is a kind of like a long line of people, or in this case, people or vehicles, but in this case, trucks. And they were driving across the country to meet in the capital of Canada, in Ottawa, where the Canadian Parliament is. And their goal was to talk to the Canadian government and say, hey, you've got a lot of restrictions that you've placed on us truckers. You want us to get shots. If we don't get shots, you want us to quarantine every time we go across the US-Canadian border. So the whole shot thing, the passports and all that, they were upset about that. They said that's an infringement on our freedom. Now, one thing you have to remember is that truckers are basically self-employed. Most of them are independent owner-operators. So, like anybody who's self-employed, you know that if you don't work, you don't make money. So, constantly having to quarantine every time you cross the border is a major imposition that represents time lost, and if it's time lost, then that means there's also money lost. So it's not that the truckers were necessarily anti-vax. Actually, a lot of the truckers did get a shot, and I think they, if I remember correctly, they had the shot at greater percentages than that of the general population. So it wasn't an anti-vax thing, it was a pro-freedom thing. So they were going to, like I said, drive across the country, drive from Western Canada, like British Columbia or Manitoba or Alberta, and drive all the way east over to the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa and meet there. So what they did was they converged on the Canadian capital, on the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa. And what they did was they basically they set up a peaceful protest. They were doing a lot of honking and all that, but they parked their trucks in the street, and it was kind of like a big party. There's a lot of festive atmosphere. There wasn't any burning or rioting or vandalism of any sort. But the thing is, it did impede business because that's how they got attention. They even blocked the Ambassador Bridge, which is the main bridge there between Michigan and Ottawa. So a lot of people, the government of Canada didn't like that. The governor in Michigan didn't like that either. So this Canadian convoy went on for 3 weeks, almost 4 weeks, almost a full month. So there was also a GoFundMe set up to support the truckers, and it raised almost $9 million. Then GoFundMe said, well, wait a minute, we disagree with what you truckers are doing, so we're not going to give you the money that was raised for you. So that upset a lot of people, and eventually GoFundMe had to back down and say, okay, we will refund you the money. So since GoFundMe didn't want to help the truckers, then the organizers set up a fundraising thing with Give Send Go, and Give Send Go said, yeah, we'll be happy to help you out with that. So they re-raised millions of dollars in that manner. But since the Canadian government didn't like the protesters, they said, hey, Give, Send, Go, you can't do that. We don't want you to do that. We want you to stop right away. Do not give the truckers that money. And then Give, Send, Go said, well, guess what? We're not a Canadian company. You have no jurisdiction over us. So they didn't comply. So the Canadian Prime Minister and the Ontario Premier and the Mayor of Ottawa, they were all trying different things to stop the protests. They were against the protests from the get-go. Justin Trudeau said, oh, it's a fringe group and they held unacceptable beliefs. And so there's a lot of, that kind of talk against the truckers. And there's a lot of negative news coverage about that. So they were trying to stop the convoy. They sent in the police, they sent in the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Those are the guys on the horses. And so there was this, there were some tensions between the protesters and the police and all that, but eventually the police made over 200 arrests, and 39 trucking companies were shut down, and there were even trucks seized. So the Canadian government really used a heavy-handed approach against these peaceful protesters. And I mentioned that some of the police, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they were on horses. And what they did was they were trying to form a cordon with the horse, a line of police and then protesters on the other side. So they surrounded the Parliament, and they're trying to push the protesters back. And so they had a line of police on foot, and then they had a line of police on horses, and they're trying to push the protesters back. Well, and part of that, I don't know what happened, but somehow one of the horses got spooked or whatever, but a woman was actually trampled by the horses. And the horse is a heavy animal. You can think she was a granny in their 50s, 60s, somewhere there. Actually, she's a First Nations individual. She's Mohawk, but the horses trampled her. Now, thankfully, she wasn't seriously injured. I think she suffered a dislocated shoulder or something like that. But that could have very easily been a very serious injury. You have a animal like a horse that weighs however many hundreds of pounds falling on this little old lady, So that was, that upset a lot of people. That was, they're saying they told the police, you're taking this too far. These people, they're not harming anyone. They're not burning anything down. They're not looting buildings. They're not looting businesses. They're just trying to make their voice heard, and then you go knocking people down like that. So the protesters still continued, but then the Prime Minister declared an emergency act, so some emergency powers to try and stop the protesters, to break up the protests. And these emergency powers allowed him to freeze bank accounts of the protesters. And not only that, he also used that to threaten people who maybe they didn't participate in the protest, but they merely donated money in support of the protesters. So a lot of people said, wait a minute, we have the right to support, we have the right to protest, and you're taking these measures you're taking these measures against us. So this is a very controversial step that he took. A lot of people came out against that, not only in Canada, but around the world. There was a civil liberties legal group in Canada that said, wait a minute, you cannot do this. In Canada, we have rights to protest, we have the right to free speech and that kind of stuff. So they were looking into taking legal action against the Prime Minister for enacting this emergency act. So eventually, the Prime Minister did lift the Emergency Act, and a lot of people, there's some speculation as to why he did that. Some people said that, well, if he's using this Emergency Act to go after people's money, to freeze their money so they can't get it, to essentially take their money from them, a lot of people say, wait a minute. If that's going to be the case, I don't want my money in the bank. I'd rather have my money in my pocket where I know that I have it instead of in a bank where the government can take it. So some people are concerned that, if it went on too long, it could produce a bank run. People would not trust the bank. They would not leave their money in the bank, and so then that would cause a lot of financial instability. So that could be one reason why he lifted the Emergency Act. Another reason people speculate is that perhaps he didn't have political support. Now, my understanding is the way things work in Canada is that the Prime Minister can declare this emergency powers type of thing, but within a certain time frame, the Parliament has to approve it. So there's two chambers in the Canadian political system. I think there's members of Parliament, and then there's the Canadian Senate. So the one group said, yeah, okay, fine. But then he needed also to get it approved by the Senate, and there's a lot of speculation that he did not have enough support from the Senate to get this thing approved. So some people speculate that perhaps he, I hear the mail. Perhaps he backed off and lifted emergency powers as a method of saving face. So that's pretty much where the Canadian convoy, truckers convoy, stands right now. The protesters have gone home, but as I mentioned previously, it's encouraged others around the globe to stand up for their rights and say no to shots and passports and quarantines and restrictions and those types of things. So now in America, there's a American convoy called the People's Convoy. It started in California, and it's making its way to Washington, D.C. for the State of the Union address tomorrow night with Biden's State of the Union. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Okay, the second piece of news that I want to cover is the Russia-Ukraine situation. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. My main purpose here is to give you an overview of what's going on, kind of give you the outline or the framework. And I don't want to get bogged down into the weeds. I'm going to try to keep this as objective as possible. I don't want to, come down on one side or the other. One thing you do have to remember is that Ukraine has a complicated history. So without that background, it's really kind of difficult to understand everything that's going on. The other thing to remember is that the situation is very fluid, as we say. So it's constantly changing. It changes not only by the day, but it can change even by the hour. So there's a lot of speculation going on, that type of thing. There's also what we call the fog of war. So you think about what fog is. Fog is where everything is very hard to see. It's hard to understand where things are and what's happening. So we have the fog of war. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation and that type of thing. So it really makes it difficult to tell what's going on. And if you try to follow things on social media, for example, you see people sharing pictures and video clips and that type of stuff. But part of the problem is they're old pictures, old video clips. They're not current. So you have to watch out for that. They try to say, this is what's happening on the streets now. But really, that picture was taken several years ago. So you want to watch out for that. There's propaganda coming from both sides. And you want to be on guard against that. Don't just jump on a bandwagon. There's a saying that goes like this: in war, the first casualty is truth. So try to be objective about things. Try not to look at things emotionally, but try to focus on the facts. And that's what I'm going to try to do here. Okay, so what's going on there? Well, Putin ordered some strikes on key targets in Ukraine, some military action against key targets in Ukraine. And in his words, he said that he wanted to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. So, in other words, he's focusing, in his own words, he's focusing not on an invasion, but he's just trying to take care of a couple of things that he sees as a threat to Russia. Another issue is that Russia does not want Ukraine to join NATO. NATO is a group that stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was a group that was formed after World War II in response to Soviet aggression for the former Soviet Union. There were some countries in Western Europe that said, we don't want communism, we don't want the Soviet Union to take over us, so let's form a treaty, a mutual pact, and if any one of us gets attacked, then the rest of the NATO members will come and protect it. So, Ukraine is not part of NATO. It was part of the Soviet Union. It broke away, I think in the 90s, whatever. But anyways, it's not part of NATO. And Russia doesn't want Ukraine to be part of NATO because Russia wants some kind of buffer between Russia and the NATO countries. So countries like Ukraine and Poland and some of the others, they form this space between the NATO countries and Russia. Actually, there is just one NATO country that has a border with Russia, and that's Norway. If you look at Norway, if you look at the very top, the very part of northern Norway, there's actually a little over 100-mile border that Norway shares with Russia. It's about, about 120 some miles, or just under 200 kilometers that Norway shares with Russia. So that's the only place where NATO and Russia have an actual border. Now, if Ukraine were to join NATO, instead of just that 200-kilometer border, you'd all of a sudden would have close to 2,300-kilometer border with Russia and Ukraine. So Russia says, no, we don't want that. That's a threat to our security as a nation. So that's one issue at hand. So Putin ordered strikes against key targets in Ukraine. We said that. And there are reports that the Russians are moving in on the capital of Ukraine, which is Kiev. Another thing that's going on is that Ukraine has asked the EU if they can join, and they said, can you hurry it up? Can you speed it up? Can you expedite this process? We want to join the EU. And there's different reasons why they could do that, but because the EU is primarily a financial or economic union, not so much a political union, so I don't know if it would necessarily be of any military benefit for them, but whatever, they said that, we'd like to join you, can you please hurry it up? And the EU says, well, wait a minute, in principle, we're not against you joining the EU, but you can't go that fast. You have to kind of take things slowly, don't rush it. So that's another aspect. Something else that's going on with Russia and Ukraine is that because of the military actions that Russia is taking inside Ukraine, a lot of Western countries, and actually, not just America and other European countries, but even Japan and those. So it's not just the West, but a lot of countries are imposing sanctions on Russia. So in other words, they're imposing financial restrictions on Russia, and what they're trying to do, of course, is create some financial pressure to get Russia to back off of their military action in Ukraine. There are also some leaders, like ex-leaders in NATO and that kind of thing. They're saying that, oh yeah, we should impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And it sounds good in theory, perhaps, but then others are saying, well, wait a minute. If NATO's starting to do that kind of stuff, you're dragging NATO into it, that could be an act of war. And the thing is, if it's just Russia and Ukraine that are fighting, then really there's no reason for other people to get involved. But if NATO starts supporting things militarily, then under the treaty, under the NATO treaty, that means that the other countries would have an obligation to, protect a NATO country that were attacked. So it could get very tricky very quickly like that. So that's what some people are concerned about. NATO shouldn't get involved because then it would escalate things and make things even worse. Some potentially, hopefully, good news is that Russia and Ukraine are engaged in ongoing peace talks on the Belarus border. So who knows where that will go. As I said before, the situation is very fluid and it can change from day to day, it can change from hour to hour. So nobody knows, of course, how this will turn out. But hopefully we can avoid an escalation of conflict. Hopefully we can avoid a war. Putin has put his nuclear forces on alert, so that could be potentially a dangerous situation. And of course nobody really wants things to get serious like that. So we should cross our fingers and hope that, and pray that things won't be that bad, that people will cool down and resolve this without going to exercising military options. So that's the news that I wanted to cover with you today. So I hope you found this helpful. Let's have a conversation in the comment box. If you have any questions or anything, just feel free to drop a note and we can go, we can continue the conversation that way. And I hope you found this helpful. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, like, share it with your friends, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.